After more than a week of anti-pipeline protests spreading now on rail tracks across the country, Via Rail has temporarily canceled most of its services and CN has shut down its eastern operations.
Obviously, we're a country of the rule of law, and we need to make sure that those laws are followed.
But earlier today, the federal government also changed the way it was engaging. The Minister of Indigenous Services has now offered to meet with the Tyendinaga Mohawk protesters in return for ending that blockade. And in BC, a similar offer from the Premier and Ottawa to the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. So what do we make of how the federal government has handled all of this? It is Thursday, and I'm here with that issue. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Althea Raj is here in Ottawa tonight. Good to see you all. Okay, so lots of movement on this story today, both the news that CN is shutting down operations east of Toronto, that Via Rail is shutting down most of its passenger trains. Obviously, that sort of changes the dynamic for the government, but I think that move started to happen even before that announcement started to happen earlier today when we saw that Mark Miller, the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, was willing to sit down in Tyendinaga and have some conversations. What changed here, do we think, or was this now the only thing that could have happened, Chantal?
Well, I'm sure the government must have had some advance notice of what was coming. I mean, there had been plenty of advance warnings from the rail companies that they were looking at closure or stopping their operations because these demonstrations were not coming to a halt. I'm guessing that from the outside, most Canadians would not be able to answer your question as to how the federal government has handled this, because the impression is that they have not handled it.
Well, is it the impression that they have not handled it, Andrew, or is it the impression that they have tried to keep it as a British Columbia Wet'suwet'en issue and now have been dragged into it?
I think those are two ways of saying the same thing. It's been a noticeable absence of leadership, in part because the Prime Minister has been overseas, in part because they don't seem to have been fully seized with this issue. It's been building over the last week from essentially a difference of political differences within the Wet'suwet'en community that has been allowed to spiral out of control. And the sight of various ministers bleating that this is a provincial matter, that don't ask us to deal with it just because it involves, for example, railways, I just think has been a pretty disgraceful absence of leadership.
Althea, do you agree with that, or do you think that there was any benefit to seeing if it could work out a different way without the federal government doing now what they're going to do over the next few days?
I agree that there was a vacuum of leadership. I think in part it was because the Prime Minister was overseas, but that I think raises other questions, like can't ministers take actions independently? I mean, surely the phone exists, right? We send PCO to follow the Prime Minister around and have a secure site wherever he goes for particular reasons. It took too long for the federal government to get involved, and I think the level of involvement was basically, I'm writing 3 emails to a group of Mohawks in Ontario, and we will respond to a letter from an Indigenous community that's tangentially related to this issue, saying Minister Bennett will sit down in British Columbia. I do think that if this is a government that wants to focus on reconciliation, part of that is not just responding when it looks like a crisis is imminent, but also making yourself available to listen earlier on in the process.
Chantal? Yep.
Oh, there are 2 things here. If it takes a rail blockade to bring the Prime Minister or his government to a conversation, that's bad from the perspective of Indigenous Canadians. But if a blockade of trains is liable to bring the government to a conversation, it's also bad.
Yep.
Because it rewards what is ultimately illegal behavior.
Yeah, I guess the hereditary chiefs that have been protesting are different, and we've all sort of read about this over the course of the week, than the elected band in Wet'suwet'en. And I wonder, again, to put it on the table, whether talking to the hereditary chiefs, which was the initial request, would have not led credence to a group of people that the majority of the community doesn't necessarily agree with. Would there have been any danger in doing that?
But did not the government of British Columbia, as far as I understand, spend some time until recently trying to come to agreement with those same chiefs? So it's not as if no one has been talking to them.
Yeah, no, and the company itself tried to reach out to them, and they didn't want to talk either. Andrew.
You not only have a difference between the elected councils and chiefs and the hereditary chiefs, you have differences within the hereditary chiefs. There were
Sure.
3 hereditary chiefs who were in favor of the pipeline who were mysteriously stripped of their title.
Yes.
So there are basic differences and breakdowns of the governance structures there, obviously with very deep roots, and we can go into all of that. But clearly, when it's become this kind of tinderbox, you got to go to the root of that and try to work out some better decision-making structure so that this sort of thing doesn't happen again.
What does it tell us about sort of reconciliation writ large? And I don't mean, like it's dead or whatever some of the protesters have been saying. I mean, in terms of how difficult it is or isn't, and the opportunities that are there that may or may not be taken by governments. I'll start with you, Althea, on that.
Well, I don't think reconciliation is dead. I think what this issue highlights is that issues that are not dealt with will continue to come to the fore, whether it's that they go to asleep for a week or two, or they go asleep for a few months, or they go asleep for a few years, they will keep popping back up on the radar. And I think the fact that if you talk to hereditary chiefs and lawyers in the groups that support them, or you talk to the federal government today, you got 2 very, very different interpretation of who they should be listening to and what the actual rights are. So obviously the issue of asserting title and what the territory is exactly and what the rights of the hereditary chiefs are and who speaks for whom, that has not been adequately dealt with.
No.
It is also, I think, sometimes the rest of the country doesn't quite understand that Indigenous Canadians don't speak with a uniform voice. And in this case, it's very clear that there's kind of like a family feud going on, and it makes it more difficult in determining who you sit down with, but also what voices are heard and which voices are not heard, and what the responsibility in the community and the nation is as well. And those are all issues that I think we need to be more aware of and more and respond more to.
Chantal, on that point too.
Well, no community in this country speaks with one voice. That doesn't exist, so that isn't really different from what happens in Indigenous communities. But the real question is not whether one should listen to the band council or hereditary chief, but whether one should listen to the will of the community. And it's far from clear for me at this point who really speaks for the will of the community, for the government of British Columbia. And few governments would have done more due diligence on an issue like that than that particular government, by the way. The sense is that the community is speaking through the band council. And that referendums have taken place. I am guessing that the usual rules apply to everyone. That is, the voice of the community has to be heard, no matter the title of the people who don't like the end result.
Mm-hmm. Last point on this, and then one quick round on John Baird. Andrew?
Well, there is a crying need for more clarity on who speaks for Indigenous peoples on these issues, not just in this present case, but more generally. There's a crying need for clarity on what exactly the duty to consult obtains, whether it's just simply whether a right to prerogative of consent or something more illusory than that. And there's an issue of what exactly reconciliation means. And the impression you get from some of these issues is it's a moving target that recedes the further you get, the closer you get to it. And unless we start to clarify these things, I think we're going to continue to be stumbling around in the dark.
Well, the risk is that people's viewpoints become even more polarized. I mean, you read some of the commentary on the left or on the right, it's so polarized that there's a hard time seeing where people can get to an agreement that's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. And that's certainly where leadership comes in. So we'll see how that unfolds over the next few days. Quickly now on the news that John Baird is also out of the Conservative leadership race, which is really the only story of the race at this point. Who doesn't want the job? Just quickly, all of you on what you make of that, Chantal.
Well, it's, again, not as exciting as it could have been. This is, at this point, looking at the field, something will have to break, or else it's called policy discussion, or else it's going to be one long, painful process to the least bad alternative being elected.
Yeesh. Andrew?
It is turning into something of a fiasco, and particularly for what, if I can borrow a phrase, I might call the conservative wing of the Conservative Party, who do not have a candidate in this race and are enormously frustrated by it. I think that's in part due to the ridiculously restrictive rules that were set up that were supposed to get the star candidates in and the SOCONs out, and they haven't succeeded on either front. But I think it's also a legacy of Stephen Harper and the failure to recruit and advance stronger candidates who could step up into this race is a real, as I said before, a really thin bench.
What do you think, Althea?
I don't think it's Stephen Harper's fault. I think there's a lot of people in the Stephen Harper cabinet who, unfortunately, for a number of personal reasons or the fact that they died, are not in this race. I don't think it has anything to do with Stephen Harper not having a strong cabinet.
There were way too many people in that cabinet who were there not because of their talents or their ideas, but because they were slavishly loyal to the leader. And everybody in the party knows it.
There were some
knows
strong cabinet ministers. John Barrett and Ron Ambrose certainly among them. James Moore. There were lots of people.
We're not through the fingers in one hand yet.
Okay. Anyways, to the point.
Okay,
I agree. This
finish,
is maybe
yes.
not
Yeah.
as interesting a contest as we had hoped. Aaron O'Toole is obviously going to try to cast himself as that movement conservative voice that can carry on the Stephen Harper tradition. Whether he's successful or not, we will see. But it seems like everybody who's decided not to contest is incredibly happy with their decision. Pierre Poilievre was in the CBC studio just earlier today and seemed as happy as I remember ever seeing him. So
yeah, I also
we'll
wonder
see.
if there's a calculation of risk, though, and I'll end on this with you, Chantal. That it's okay to take a job if you know you're going to win and then you know you're going to be prime minister. If the risk is too high to meet those bars, it's not really as tantalizing, is it?
I think there's as good a chance of becoming prime minister if you're a strong candidate in this race as there ever was. The political cycle is much further in the case of Justin Trudeau than it was the last time the Conservatives picked a leader. There is no reason to believe that the next Conservative leader would not have a strong shot at becoming Prime Minister in 24 months.
That makes it even stranger then, doesn't it? If it's a legitimate shot, why wouldn't you want to try it?
It's really hard in the contest period that you have to be able to come in as an outsider and win. Basically, you have until February 27th to decide, until April 17th to sell members.
Yeah.
And
Except
memberships,
John Barrett
and
was
then
far
that's
from
it.
an outsider.
And raise
right?
$500,000.
Yeah.
Right, but
Yeah.
Barrett had a lot of baggage too, right? And there are people like Ron Ambrose, like John Barrett, that will be treated differently. Like now they've become like statesmen in the party. And then we're going to start asking questions about Barrick Gold and their Saudi contracts. And why did you say what you said about Saudi Arabia when the Canadian government was being critical? Those are maybe conversations that he's sitting at home in his office and thinking, hey, I'm making like great 6-figure, maybe 7-figure, I don't know, salaries. Why would I ever want to do this?
Right.
Canada is already deeply engaged in multilateral fora on advancing priorities that we have, like peace and security, economic opportunity, and countering the impacts of climate change. Being on the Security Council is a further way of us to have an either greater impact in standing up for the principles we believe in and being a voice for allies and friends.
That was the Prime Minister speaking in Senegal this week. Trudeau has been on a bit of a tour looking to get some support from countries in Africa as Canada makes its pitch for a seat on the UN Security Council. So will it work and does it matter? Chantal, Andrew and Althea all back now for another round of At Issue. So it looks like he's locked down one vote, although I understand that the votes can change on a dime. So I don't know how locked down
And we don't know,
is.
secret ballot.
Yeah, we don't really know. But
Dime is an interesting choice of words.
yes, for a bid that has so far, when we asked Global Affairs this week, $2.14 million just so far, and he's set to make another trip to the Caribbean in the coming weeks. So is this, I'll start with you, Andrew. What do you make of this? This is how you get these seats. It's what Norway's doing, it's what Ireland's doing, but is this something we should be doing?
Look, if you offered us a seat in the Security Council for free, I wouldn't turn it down. But it's a temporary seat on a body that is notably ineffectual, either issuing resolutions that are routinely ignored or more often than that, even failing to come to resolutions. So I guess one has to ask, is the game worth the candle? What kinds of deals are being made to try and secure these votes? are we propping up, because so many of the countries that are voting are not democracies, are not even decent countries in their human rights record. So what kinds of deals are we making? Are we propping up some of these dictatorships with infusions of cash? Are we looking the other way at human rights violations? So much of this, of course, goes on behind closed doors. And ultimately, for what kind of real payoff, I think there's legitimate questions to be asked about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the Prime Minister has said things about values or multilateralism or those kinds of words about Canada being able to have influence. And certainly this is the first time in 2 decades now that we have not had a seat. So, Chantal, how much weight do you give those arguments that this is a place where Canada's voice is needed?
Well, on the scale of the well-being of humanity, the main contenders against Canada certainly also fit the bill. So I think we're not saving the UN Security Council from peril by not winning a seat on the Security Council. I find it a bit of an odd decision to pursue this at this time in the government's current circumstances. I'm sure the Prime Minister couldn't have imagined what would happen at home over the past week while he was away. But the result is that he has looked distant and not in the right place at the right time, which is not terribly good for a minority Prime Minister. On top of that, based on past experience with the Oka crisis or other conflicts like that, he probably lost as much support for that bid for that Security Council seat with the pictures of collisions between the RCMP and elders, Indigenous elders, as he may have gained on the road.
Althea, your thoughts on why this seems to be so important to the Prime Minister, the government, and whether they should be spending this kind of time and money to do it?
It is very important to him because he personally announced it, and it will be a personal blow to Justin Trudeau if we do not win a seat on the Security Council. Do we deserve a seat on the Security Council? Frankly, I don't know. I don't find that the platform that we've outlined to have a seat is very inspiring. I mean, we're not talking about things like responsibility to protect or these big, great ideas that we really wanted to champion the last time that we actually sat at the UN Security Council. When we ran for the Security Council seat under Stephen Harper, I think the decision had been basically made under the previous Liberal government. But the Harper government didn't have a reason for people to vote for Canada, and they didn't vote for Canada. Norway is a superstar, and so we're basically, I think, competing with Ireland, who will say, they're a smaller nation, and basically much of the same things that we're saying. They have this glossy video with a U2 soundtrack, talking about the great things that they want to accomplish at the UN Security Council, and it kind of actually sounds like our bid. So, do we deserve to be there? Will we win? It's hard to say, but Justin Trudeau is very personally popular, so he is an asset. He's supposed to continue this tour by going to Barbados to hobnob and try to get votes from Caribbean nations on Monday and Tuesday. Whether that's a good idea, knowing what's happening back home, I don't know anymore.
Yeah, I remember, because I don't remember us ever having a Security Council while I've been in Ottawa, a seat while I've been in Ottawa, but I remember us losing, certainly, and it was fairly devastating for the Harper government. And it also really solidified the Conservatives' view of the UN, and it became sort of fractious for the many years after. So I can only imagine, and I'll put this to you, Andrew, as Althea points out, the potential damage it would do to Justin Trudeau, who is in a different sort of space when it comes to things like this. I mean, the headlines were pretty terrible when we lost.
Yeah, I think this would be the final death blow to the Canada's back meme. Look, if we'd like to contribute to the welfare of the world, we could maybe start by pulling our fair share when it comes to foreign aid, ponying up for peacekeeping operations where we've been notable laggards, doing more to live up to our NATO obligations. There's a number of ways in which we have actually been international laggards. So it's a bit much for us now to swan up to the Security Council and say, elect us, we're so wonderful.
Well, laggard is a bit strong. I mean, we still give more than $300 million to different UN projects.
Maybe so, but we're still falling short of the targets. It would also help probably if we were on track to meet our climate change targets.
Oh no, now she's opening up a whole new can of worms.
Yeah,
I'm going to leave it on that. Chantal, Andrew, and Althea, thank you all. Appreciate it. See you next week.